Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Hilliard at Home. Today's topic is the Enlightenment, which was a major philosophical and political movement in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Enlightenment is often called the Age of Reason, and it led to many significant advances in the sciences and in the development of liberal and democratic governments. That said, it was also the period that saw the rise of colonialism and slavery as major pillars of emerging global trade systems. We'll try to do justice to both sides of the Enlightenment's legacy, but our main focus will be on understanding the philosophical ideas at the center of the movement. So, what exactly was the Enlightenment? In many ways, the Enlightenment was an extension of the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries that saw the recovery of humanistic ideas from the classical age of Greece and Rome and ushered Europe out of the so-called Dark Ages of the medieval period when the humanism of the classical period was lost. But while the Renaissance saw a flowering of the arts and a surge in exploration, the achievements of the Enlightenment were more focused on the areas of science and political reform. But let's back up for a minute, because we need to quickly review the concept of humanism. Now, keep in mind that there's a whole Hilliard at Home video on humanism that you can find in e-courses, and the emergence of humanism within the Renaissance period is also covered in depth in the video on the Puritans, so you can review those videos to gain a fuller understanding of the history and the ideas of humanism. In a nutshell, however, humanism is the idea that human beings, individually and collectively, have agency and should have the freedom to exercise it. Agency means the capacity for action, or the power to change the conditions of one's existence, or to shape one's own destiny. So, with its deep faith in human agency, humanism is an optimistic view of human progress achieved by unleashing the full potential of human agency. In other words, it's the idea that we can build better societies and better lives by giving people the freedom and resources to explore the world around them and act upon it. Now, during the Renaissance period, ideas about the sources of human agency were left pretty vague, but Enlightenment thinkers had pretty specific ideas about how human individuals have and exercise agency. And those ideas revolved around the faculty of reason, which is why the Enlightenment is also called the Age of Reason. For some context here, let's think back to the basics of the Puritan belief system. Remember that the Puritans believed that since Adam ate the apple, human nature is fundamentally depraved and corrupted. For Puritans, this meant that if we rely on things like our own perceptions and reasonings to chart our course, we'll be led down a pathway to sin and damnation, because things like perception and reason belong to the corruption of nature. For Puritans, then, the only source of moral knowledge is the revealed wisdom of Scripture, the truths that were revealed by God to those who wrote the Bible. Well, at the very core of the Enlightenment was a rejection of the ideas of human depravity and revealed knowledge. Enlightenment thinkers generally believed in a benevolent or kind deity who created humanity with the tools to discover moral truths for themselves. For the early thinkers of the Enlightenment, these tools included the 5 faculties of perception, vision, hearing, taste, touch, and smell, and the mental faculty of reason. Some later Enlightenment thinkers included the emotions among these truth-finding faculties, but even they understood reason as the most important faculty. In fact, some Enlightenment thinkers understood the human individual almost as a reasoning machine. Now, this idea of the reasoning machine ties into the larger Enlightenment cosmology. A cosmology is just a theory of what reality is, or how the natural universe works. So, again, the Enlightenment cosmology centered upon the idea of a benevolent and omniscient creator. Benevolent just means kind, and omniscient means all-knowing. Some Enlightenment thinkers understood this deity to be the Christian God of the New Testament, but many others were deists who did not directly connect this benevolent creator to the God of Christian Scripture. Either way, these Enlightenment thinkers understood this benevolent creator to be kind of like a watchmaker who designs all the intricate gears and levers of a perfect machine and then is able to sit back and watch it run. Now, an actual watchmaker may need to occasionally intervene in the runnings of the watch to fix its flawed machinery. But the omniscient creator of the Enlightenment universe has created a perfect machine that has no flaws and needs no intervention. So this means no miracles, no direct communication between God and man, which means no revealed wisdom, and no rewards or punishments delivered from on high. Though Enlightenment thinkers did believe that order, prosperity, and happiness follow naturally from living in harmony with the laws of nature, while chaos and suffering tend to follow when we violate those laws. Now, these laws of nature are permanent and unchanging and never need to be corrected or adjusted. They include physical laws like gravity or the laws of motion, but they also include the laws of human nature, like the laws that govern how our perceptions work, or the reasoning operations that we can perform. Which means that the human individual, just like the universe as a whole, is like a perfectly designed machine that operates according to permanent and unchanging laws. To get a better understanding of this Enlightenment understanding of the human self, it'll help to look at the ideas of one of the earliest and most influential Enlightenment thinkers, British philosopher John Locke. Locke is famous for two things, his political theory and his theory of the mind, and these two things were very closely connected. In his political theory, Locke famously argued that the authority of any government derives from the consent of the governed, meaning that no government has a right to govern if the people reject its authority. This was a really important idea that helped to pave the way for more democratic forms of government. Prior to the Enlightenment, many people believed in the idea of the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs had a special authority and a special knowledge given to them by God that justified them in holding power over others. But Locke was an Enlightenment thinker who rejected any idea of revealed knowledge or of a deity that directly intervenes in the affairs of the world. In fact, Locke famously referred to the mind as a tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slate. According to this theory of the mind, we're born without any knowledge, and the only way that we develop knowledge is by perceiving the world around us and then reasoning upon those perceptions. Now, this means that we are born with a certain mental equipment. Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers understood the human mind to be equipped to perform certain reasoning operations, and that all human minds have this same basic equipment. Now, we all have different types of knowledge because we've experienced different sets of perceptions, but we have the same basic reasoning faculties. So imagine a machine that makes sausages. If you put chicken and apples into the machine, you're going to get very different sausages than if you put, say, pork and chili powder into the machine. But the machine itself and the sausage-making process remains the same. This is how Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke understood the human mind to work. We all have the same basic mental machinery, but we have different knowledge outputs because we have different perception inputs. And again, no one has any knowledge that comes from any source other than perception and reasoning. So, for Locke and the other Enlightenment thinkers, humanity was created with the power of reason so that we could discover and understand the laws that govern the universe, or natural laws, so that we can develop societies and ways of life that are in harmony with those laws. Locke, for instance, understood the monarchies that rose to power during the medieval period to be out of step with natural law, which causes widespread discord and suffering. He understood more liberal and democratic forms of government to be in harmony with natural law, and therefore to be more likely to cultivate general happiness and prosperity. Think about it this way. If a person was made to be dominated or subordinated to another person or group of people, why would that person possess the higher reasoning faculties of the human individual? Domesticated animals are perfectly obedient subordinates precisely because they lack those higher reasoning faculties. In other words, according to Enlightenment thinking, the very existence of the faculty of reason was proof that human individuals were meant to chart their own paths rather than be dominated, subordinated, or otherwise limited in their possibilities. At this point, we might ask how an institution like slavery could thrive during the Enlightenment period. First, it should be noted that many prominent Enlightenment thinkers were opposed to slavery and participated in some of the early forms of anti-slavery activism. Others just looked the other way. But it's also true that many proponents of Enlightenment thinking were either slaveholders or were complicit in allowing slavery to persist. This is most evident when we look at the founding of the United States and the role of slaveholders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The founding of the United States was nothing if not a grand experiment in putting the ideas of the Enlightenment into practice. The founders understood themselves to be using reason to design a system of government that was perfectly attuned to the laws of human nature. For instance, when they wrote about things like checks and balances, the bicameral system, and the need for an electoral college, it's clear that they understood these things as devices for managing the workings of human nature within political processes. Nevertheless, slaveholders like Jefferson twisted the logic of Enlightenment philosophy to justify slavery. They suggested that people of African descent did not display the same mental faculties as white people, and that their different natures actually made them better suited to subordination than to freedom. In short, They simply refuse to extend the logic of Enlightenment liberalism to people of color. So, this brings us to the Enlightenment understanding of morality. For many Enlightenment thinkers, there was no such thing as sin exactly. For instance, Benjamin Franklin argued that nothing was sinful because it had been declared to be so by some higher law or higher authority. Instead, Franklin argued, certain things should be considered wrong simply because they are harmful. And they're harmful because they work against the natural laws that govern the universe. So Franklin's ideas were very much in line with John Locke's. And one of Locke's central observations about human nature is that the human individual is driven by self-interest. At the most basic level, he argued, we as individuals seek security, pleasure, and prosperity for ourselves, and we use reason to figure out how best to acquire these things. But Locke and Franklin recognized that one of the things that we quickly discover is that we cannot experience security, pleasure, and prosperity in isolation or when we are in conflict with other people. In other words, reason reveals to us that we're social creatures and that our social bonds create relations of mutual need and mutual interest. Consequently, our own interests are best secured when other people have an interest in helping us secure them. And other people take an interest in helping us secure our interests when we demonstrate an interest in helping them to secure theirs. So Locke and Franklin argued that when we observe the world around us and use reason to draw conclusions from what we observe, we realize that the best way to secure the good for ourselves is to help secure the good for others. This is the idea of enlightened self-interest. It says that even though our basic nature is to be self-interested, it is this very self-interestedness that leads us to seek harmonious and happy relationships with others. And this pursuit of harmonious social relations leads us to work toward developing better governments, better laws, better institutions, and so forth. Locke referred to this as the social contract, which is the idea that the enlightened individual willingly sacrifices some of his freedoms and immediate interests in order to participate in a harmonious social order in which he'll be better able to secure his higher and more long-term interests. So, for instance, it might be in my immediate interest to trick you into giving me that $100 bill that you have in your pocket. But if I'm an enlightened, rational individual, I understand that I'm better off in the long term if you trust and respect me and take an interest in my well-being. That won't happen if I run off with your $100 bill. Now, some Enlightenment thinkers worried that Locke's theory of enlightened self-interest painted too negative a picture of human nature, and because of this, that it veered a little too close to atheism. Many of these thinkers wanted to be able to reconcile Enlightenment philosophy with New Testament Christian theology so that it would gain more acceptance. But it was hard to imagine a truly benevolent creator who would design humanity so that its defining characteristic is self-interest. These concerns led to what is sometimes referred to as the Scottish Enlightenment because it was led by Scottish philosophers like Francis Hutcheson and Adam Ferguson. Other prominent members of the Scottish Enlightenment were Adam Smith, whose book, The Wealth of Nations, is considered one of the foundations of capitalist economic theory, and David Hume, whose A Treatise on Human Understanding was one of the most influential philosophical texts of the 18th century, though unlike his Scottish peers, Hume had little interest in Christianity or any other religious ideas. So these Scottish thinkers developed what is sometimes referred to as moral sense theory, which stems from the idea that the most basic drive of the human individual is not self-interest, but instead the need to be in sympathy with others, the need to sympathize with others and have others sympathize with you. Now, to sympathize with someone is to identify with them, to see them as similar to yourself, and therefore to want good things for them. So most Scottish Enlightenment thinkers understood the human individual to be fundamentally benevolent, like the benevolent creator, rather than fundamentally selfish. Here's how their thinking went. Scottish Enlightenment thinkers recognized that when we observe actions by other people, we have an immediate emotional response that kicks in before we have time to use reason. So, for instance, if you're walking down the sidewalk and you see someone steal something, okay, this guy is stealing money, but let's imagine that you see him snatch a muffin from a small child. Your initial emotional response to this would probably be something like disgust. Before any kind of reasoning process kicks in, you would naturally, emotionally, disapprove of the man's action. Now, maybe later you realize that the child has a terrible allergy, and the man took the muffin to prevent a potentially fatal reaction to its contents. Using reason, then, you would recognize the man's actions as virtuous rather than vile. Nevertheless, your initial, natural response to the type of action he performed is disgust or disapproval. Now imagine that you're walking down the same street and you see a man help an elderly woman across the busy street safely. In this situation, your immediate response would probably be the opposite of disgust, right? You would feel very positively about the man's actions. Now, maybe upon reflection, you might recognize that the man is running for political office and is just trying to make himself look good. And then you might feel more negatively about his actions. Nevertheless, before any kind of reasoning process kicks in, your natural response to the type of action he has performed is pleasure or approval. The Scottish Enlightenment philosophers called this a moral sense. They argued that when the benevolent watchmaker designed humanity, he wired our emotions so that we're naturally pleased by certain types of actions and naturally disgusted by other types of actions. In other words, even before reason kicks in, we're naturally designed to approve of actions that are generally benevolent and disapprove of actions that are generally vicious or selfish. Now, as our two examples demonstrate, the specific circumstances around any given action might mean that a seemingly vicious action is actually benevolent, like the man snatching a muffin in order to prevent a violent allergic reaction, or that a seemingly benevolent action is actually selfish, like the politician helping the elderly woman. But, generally speaking, snatching muffins is vicious and wrong, and helping elderly people is benevolent and good. So, our natural emotional responses, which, again, kick in before reason, act as a kind of moral sense, and they were designed that way by a benevolent creator who wanted to give us the tools to discover moral truths and find the good. Okay, so these Scottish Enlightenment philosophers argued that when we approve of an action, we sympathize with that action and with the person responsible for it. We identify with the goodness of that action, meaning that we see, or at least we want to see, the same goodness in ourselves. We have a sense of connection, fellow feeling, or identity with the action and the person who has performed it. When we disapprove of an action, we experience the opposite of sympathy, or a sense of revulsion. We see ourselves as different from that action and the person who performed it. We disidentify. Now, the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers argued that the highest form of pleasure that we're capable of experiencing is the pleasure of sympathy, the pleasure of sympathizing with others and having others sympathize with us. This means that we're constantly seeking the pleasure of sympathy. At the most basic level, we're sympathy seekers. So the main way that we use our power of reason is to figure out how best to be in sympathy with others. In other words, we see the types of actions that generally inspire us to sympathize with the people performing them, and then we use reason to figure out how we can behave in ways that will inspire others to sympathize with us. And since the types of actions that generally inspire sympathy are good, benevolent actions, this process of sympathy seeking leads us to become good, benevolent people. It also leads us to work toward developing good, benevolent governments and societies, and so on. So within the Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, reason is still front and center, but the most important inputs for our rational processes are the emotional responses that guide us towards sympathy and goodness. Now, the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment were very popular and extremely influential, and they have an interesting connection to literature. The 18th century, which saw the emergence of the Scottish Enlightenment, was also the period in which the novel rose to prominence as a major literary form, and the most popular type of novel was the sentimental novel. Now, many scholars have noted that the sentimental novel was basically a genre geared toward popularizing the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment. The main theme of any sentimental novel is sympathy as an instrument of moral reform. In other words, they feature characters who change from bad to good or vicious to virtuous through their natural sympathy for innocent, virtuous characters who are usually victimized in some way. This often took the form of seduction narratives, in which a man with loose morals attempts to seduce a virtuous woman, but is ultimately transformed through his love for her, that is, through his natural sympathy with her innocence and virtue. This was the plot of one of the first and most popular British novels of the 18th century, Samuel Richardson's Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, which featured the moral transformation of the infamous Mr. B. Interestingly, Richardson was criticized for inspiring young women to seek out men without virtue in order to try to reform them. So, in response, he wrote a second novel, Clarissa, or The History of a Young Lady. In this novel, the virtuous Clarissa resists the seductions of the licentious Robert Lovelace, but instead of being transformed through his sympathy with her virtue, Lovelace rapes her and she ultimately dies. That said, Lovelace's accomplice, Mr. Bedford, does sympathize with Clarissa and turns to a more virtuous path. Now, not all sentimental novels were seduction novels. One of the most popular and historically significant novels of all time is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which contains several sentimental plot lines. In one of the most famous scenes of the novel, the young slave Eliza seeks shelter for herself and her young son in a northern home after escaping across the Ohio River. The man of the house is an Indiana state senator, and he has just returned from the state capitol, where he voted in favor of a fugitive slave bill that made it a criminal act for any citizen of Indiana to shelter or aid an escaped slave. Eliza begs for help, explaining that she ran away because her master was going to sell her son away from her, and she couldn't bear to lose another child. Senator Byrd, who himself has experienced the loss of a child, is moved to tears as he sympathizes with Eliza's virtuous love for her son and her courage in protecting him. Through his sympathy, Senator Byrd identifies with Eliza, recognizing for the first time that a black individual is no less human, no less virtuous, and no less deserving of liberty and dignity than he is himself. He is moved to do the right thing, which meant breaking the very law that he has just helped to pass. He not only gives Eliza shelter, but also helps her escape to Canada. So Stowe's novel, like Richardson's, was structured around the logic of the Scottish Enlightenment, meaning that it modeled the idea that virtuous selfhood stems from our natural tendency to sympathize with certain types of actions and the people who perform them. So Senator Byrd's transformation modeled what Stowe hoped to achieve with her novel as a whole, a virtuous transformation of the American public through the power of sympathy. Well, that wraps up our discussion of the Enlightenment. In a moment, you'll see links to other Hilliard at Home videos, but you should also be able to find links to those videos in e-courses. You should also check e-courses for any quizzes, discussion boards, or assignments related to this video. Thanks for watching.